There was a night in Wyoming, winter of 1882, when a man walked into a sheriff's office and told the truth. He said a name. He said what that man was planning. He said people were going to die before morning light touched the Powder River Basin. The sheriff listened, nodded, and did nothing. 3 people were dead by 7 the next morning. I've ridden through enough of this country to know that story isn't rare. It happened more than once. It happened more than a dozen times across this frontier. What makes this one matter is what came after, and what it tells you about the men who wore the badge in this territory, and why so many of them weren't worth the tin they pinned to their chests. If you're new here, subscribe now. I cover the West as it actually was, not the dime novel version, not the picture show version, the real one, the one with blood in the snow and politics in the courtroom, and nobody riding off clean into the sunset. Let's go back to Wyoming. Let's go back to 1882. You have to understand what Wyoming was in that year. It was still a territory, wouldn't be a state for another 8 years. The U.S. government had carved it out, given it a structure, appointed a governor, set up a territorial legislature. But law enforcement on the ground was something different entirely. Sheriffs in Wyoming territory were elected. Let that settle in for a moment. They weren't appointed by men who knew something about the law. They weren't vetted by any professional standard. They were voted in by whatever collection of men happened to be in the county at election time. Cowboys, merchants, saloon keepers, land agents. And the men who controlled the largest amounts of money controlled the largest amounts of votes. In 1882, that money came from cattle. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association was, by that year, the most powerful political force in the territory. They represented the big outfits, the English-owned spreads, the Eastern investor operations, the ranches that ran tens of thousands of head across open range. These were not small men. These were men who corresponded with senators and governors, men who had lawyers on retainer in 3 cities, men who understood that a sheriff who did what they needed done was worth more than any ranch hand they could hire. The association had a word for the men who challenged their dominance of the range. They called them rustlers. Sometimes that was true. Sometimes a man had in fact taken cattle that weren't his. But the label got applied broadly. It got applied to small ranchers who ran their own herds on the same open range. It got applied to homesteaders who fenced land the big outfits had been using for free. It got applied to anyone who stood in the way of the cattle barons consolidating what they considered to be their territory. And the sheriffs, the elected sheriffs, often knew which side their bread was buttered on. That's the world you need to hold in your head when I tell you what happened in the winter of 1882. The county in question sat along the eastern slopes of the Bighorn Mountains. It was rough country, hard winters, the kind of cold that kills cattle and men alike if they're not prepared. Small ranchers had been moving into that country through the late 1870s, staking claims, running small herds, trying to build something on land the big outfits had never legally owned, but had long treated as their private domain. Tension had been building for years. It wasn't abstract tension. It was the kind that showed up as cut fences and poisoned water holes and horses shot in the night. The kind that left men riding double because someone had burned their stable. The kind that made families sleep with rifles inside the door. The man I'm telling you about, I'll call him Crane, because that's close enough to the name that shows up in the depositions taken afterward. Crane had been a problem for one of the large operations in that county for the better part of 2 years. He wasn't a rustler. What he was a witness. He'd seen things, documented things. He knew who had ordered the burning of a small rancher's home the previous spring. He knew who had ridden with the group that drove another family off their claim at gunpoint. He'd made statements. He'd talked to the territorial land office. He'd talked to a newspaper correspondent who'd passed through. And he'd talked to the county sheriff. That was his mistake. Not because talking to the sheriff was wrong. Because this particular sheriff, I'll give him the name Dowd, which again is close enough to the record. Because Dowd was the association's man. Had been for 3 years, got elected on their money and their organization and their ability to turn out the right voters on the right day. Dowd wasn't a coward. I want to be clear about that. Cowardice is simple. What Dowd was calculating. He understood where his obligations lay. He understood that Crane's testimony pointed toward men who could end his career and make his life difficult in ways that had nothing to do with guns. So when complaints came in about Crane, Dowd listened carefully, and when, in the weeks before that December night, a man connected to the large outfit began making threats, open threats, the kind said in saloons with enough witnesses that there was no pretending they hadn't been said, Dowd noted them and filed them away and did very little else. The night I'm telling you about, a man came to Dowd's office. This wasn't a rumor merchant or a drunk looking for attention. This was a man with a reputation for straight talk, a freighter who ran supplies between the railroad and the outlying ranches. A man who had no stake in the range war beyond what happened to his customers. He'd heard something specific. He'd seen something specific. The man connected to the large outfit, I'll call him Acker because that name appears in subsequent accounts. Acker had been drinking since midday. He'd been talking about Crane. He'd been specific about what he intended to do. He'd named the morning. He'd said where. The freighter told Dowd all of this. Dowd asked him how much he'd had to drink himself. The freighter said he was sober as a post, and Dowd knew it. Dowd said he couldn't arrest a man for talking in a saloon. Said there were no grounds. Said the freighter ought to go home and let the law handle the law. The freighter left. He went to two other men he trusted and told them what Dowd had said. Those conversations are documented. They came out in the inquest testimony afterward. The freighter was not the only man who tried to raise the alarm that night. A woman whose brother-in-law worked for the large outfit sent word to Dowd's deputy. The deputy said he'd pass it along. He did not rouse his boss. He did not ride out. He went to bed. That night, Acker left the saloon. He wasn't alone. He had two men with him. Range hands from the large outfit who were known to do whatever they were told and not ask questions that might get them fired. They rode to where Crane lived. It was a small place, a house, a barn, a corral with a few horses. Crane had a hired man who slept in the barn, a man who'd been working for him through the fall. And that night, Crane had a visitor, a neighboring small rancher who'd come to talk business and stayed too late to ride home in the cold. He was sleeping on Crane's floor. By 7 in the morning, all three of them were dead. The hired man was found in the barn. The neighbor was found inside the house. Crane himself was found near the corral gate, which suggests he'd heard something and tried to get to his horses, tried to get away. He didn't make it. The snow recorded what happened. Snow is an honest witness. It doesn't lie and it doesn't forget. The tracks of 3 horses coming in from the northeast. 3 sets of boot prints moving through the property. The positions of the bodies. All of it was there for anyone who cared to read it. The county coroner read it. He convened an inquest within 2 days. Witnesses were called. The freighter testified. The woman who'd sent word to the deputy testified. 2 men from town who'd heard Acker's threats in the saloon testified. The deputy testified, and his testimony was notably careful, notably vague, notably concerned with covering his own absence of action. Dowd testified. He said he'd received no credible specific threat. He said the freighter's information had been unverified. He said he had no legal authority to detain a man based on conversation in a saloon. He was technically correct on that last point. Frontier law had its limits. But those limits had not prevented sheriffs from jailing men overnight on far less, when those men didn't have the association's support. The inquest jury found that Crane, the hired man, and the neighbor had died at the hands of persons unknown. That was the official finding. Persons unknown. Everyone in that county knew who those persons were. Acker and his 2 companions were never charged. Acker remained employed by the large outfit for another 3 years. One of the 2 hands with him that night drifted south toward Colorado. The other one stayed and eventually died in a different dispute, which is a different story. What happened to Dowd is more instructive. He served out his term. When he ran for re-election, he lost. Not by much, but he lost. The men who voted against him weren't united by any particular politics. They were united by the knowledge of what he'd done and what he'd failed to do. Frontier communities had long memories. They might not be able to put a man in prison for inaction, but they could refuse to give him power again. Dowd left the county within a year of losing the election. He relocated east, Kansas, according to one account. His name doesn't appear in Wyoming records after 1884. What replaced him, eventually, imperfectly, violently, was a pattern that repeated itself across this territory and others. When official law failed, men organized outside of it. The vigilante committee is a thing the dime novels turned into something exciting. Masked riders, torches, rough justice dispensed with drama. The reality was less theatrical and more grim. These committees were formed by men who had exhausted the official channels, who had gone to the sheriff and been turned away, who had filed complaints and watched them disappear, who had seen the inquest juries return findings of persons unknown when everyone in the room knew exactly which persons. They weren't romantic figures. They were tired men who'd run out of patience with a system that wasn't working. In Wyoming, the vigilante tradition predated the range wars. There are documented committee actions going back to the 1860s in this territory. By 1882, the pattern was well established. Men who couldn't get legal relief took their own. Sometimes they were right about who deserved it. Sometimes they weren't. The absence of due process cuts both ways. It can punish the guilty faster than courts, and it can punish the innocent just as fast. What the Crane case fed into was a broader reckoning with the question of who law enforcement in this territory actually served. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association understood something that took the small ranchers and homesteaders longer to grasp. The law is not a neutral instrument. It is used by whoever controls it. In 1882, in that county, the association controlled the sheriff's office. Not through explicit bribery, though money changed hands in various forms, but through political organization, through social connection, through the simple logic that the men with the most to protect had the strongest incentive to make sure the man with the badge was their man. When Dowd told the freighter he had no grounds to act, he was telling the truth in a technical sense. But he was also making a choice. Every day a man makes dozens of choices that the law doesn't require of him. A sheriff can find reasons to act or reasons not to act. Dowd found reasons not to act. He found them because finding reasons to act would have cost him more than he was willing to pay. That calculation, that specific, clear-eyed, self-interested calculation, cost 3 men their lives. The freighter who'd warned Dowd didn't leave the territory. That's a detail I think matters. He stayed, he testified, he talked to anyone who would listen. He wasn't loud about it, wasn't the type, but he was consistent. And in the years that followed, when the larger reckoning came to Wyoming, when the tensions between the large outfits and the small ranchers boiled over into what history records as the Johnson County War, the memory of cases like this one was part of what drove it. Men don't forget when the law fails them. They don't forgive it easily either. And when the official structure of law enforcement is perceived to be an instrument of the powerful against the powerless, the legitimacy of that structure erodes. Not all at once, slowly, the way a river undercuts a bank, invisible until the bank falls in. The mythology of the frontier lawman runs deep in American memory. The straight-shooting sheriff who upholds the law regardless of who's asking, who pins on the badge because he believes in something, who stands in the street and faces what needs facing. That man existed. I've known a few of them, or heard accounts of a few of them from men I trusted. They existed in the same territory and the same era as Dowd. They wore the same kind of badge. They operated under the same legal constraints. The difference was not in the law. The difference was in the man. What the Crane case documents, and cases like it which appear throughout the territorial records of Wyoming, Montana, Colorado, New Mexico in this era, is that the mythology and the reality were running on parallel tracks that rarely intersected. The mythology said the law protected everyone equally. The reality said the law protected whoever had the power to shape how it was used. That reality was not unique to the frontier. It was not unique to 1882. But on the frontier, the consequences were immediate and physical in a way that made them impossible to ignore. When the law failed you in a city, you might suffer economically, socially, legally. When the law failed you in a Wyoming county in winter, you might end up in the snow by your corral gate at 7 in the morning with no one coming to help you. The 3 men who died that night, Crane, the hired man, the neighbor who'd stayed too late, none of them had done anything that merited what happened to them. Crane had been a witness. The hired man had been sleeping in a barn. The neighbor had been sleeping on a floor because it was too cold to ride home. They were ordinary men in ordinary circumstances who ran into the specific and catastrophic failure of a system that was supposed to protect them and didn't. I've covered a lot of ground in my time. I've seen a lot of graves that didn't have to be dug. The ones that stay with me are the ones where somebody knew, where somebody warned somebody, where the information was there and the action wasn't. The freighter who went to Dowd's office that night told the truth. He did what a man is supposed to do. He went to the law. He put the information in the hands of the person whose job it was to act on it. And the person whose job it was to act on it made a different calculation. That's not a story about exceptional evil. Dowd wasn't a monster. He was a man who served his interests and called it something else. Called it procedure. Called it legality. Called it the limits of his authority. Men who fail in their obligations usually have a name for it that doesn't sound like failure. The real story is systemic. It's about what happens when the selection process for law enforcement produces men who are primarily accountable to power rather than to law. It's about what happens in a territory with limited oversight and enormous economic stakes, and elections that can be shaped by the men with the deepest pockets. It's about the gap between what law enforcement is supposed to be and what it often actually is when no one is watching closely enough. Wyoming would spend the next decade working through that gap in increasingly violent ways. The Johnson County War of 1892, the event most historians point to as the culmination of the Range Wars, was built on a decade of accumulated grievances, accumulated failures of official law, accumulated bodies in the snow. The night a Wyoming sheriff refused to arrest a man is not a footnote to that history. It is the history. Repeated, documented, built into the foundation of what followed. Before I close out, if you've stayed with me this long, you know what this channel is. No embellishment, no heroes who didn't exist. The frontier as it actually was. Complicated, brutal, and worth understanding. Subscribe if you want more of that. There's plenty more to tell. 3 people died in the winter of 1882 because a man with a badge made a calculation that their lives were worth less than his political comfort. The freighter who warned him lived with that knowledge for the rest of his days. You can find his testimony in the inquest record. Dry, legal language, careful and precise. But if you read it closely, you can hear what he's actually saying underneath the formality. He's saying, I told them exactly what was going to happen. I told them and they didn't listen, and here we are. That's the truest thing recorded from that night. I told them and they didn't listen, and here we are. The snow doesn't forget, the record doesn't forget, and I don't either.